This advanced discussion on stance width also relates high bar to low bar. Generally, you can make an analogy that low bar is better suited with wide stance, high bar better suited with narrow stance. Again, those are general guidelines, but they do not apply across the board. What a narrow stance is going to give you is likely more quad involvement. A bigger chunk of that pie of muscle recruitment is going to be put on the quads. A narrow stance is also going to require more forward knee travel. Because of that, you'll get into a deeper knee flexion, which is this. And that deeper knee flexion is what's going to put the emphasis more on the quads. A narrow stance is generally going to be easier to achieve depth because a lot of the hip flexion is not going to become the limiting factor on getting depth. The narrower stance is going to have a lower ceiling for your maximal strength. The reason for this, you have a longer range of motion with smaller prime movers. So the total range of motion of the bar is generally most likely going to be longer, and that longer range of motion is going to be required by the quads being the main movers as opposed to the posterior hamstrings, glutes. So a longer range of motion with smaller prime movers probably means that the ceiling is lower. But again, if you've seen the disclaimer video, it's easy to find world record holders out there, world champions that squat with a narrow stance. Narrow stance can be tough on the knees because it requires more knee flexion. So if you have bad knees, it might not be good for you. You can try wearing knee sleeves or knee wraps, but the narrow stance squat is going to put a little more emphasis on the knees and more stress on the knees. Conversely, it will be a little bit easier on the low back and the hips. So you're not getting into as deep hip flexion, which will be conserving and better for the hip joint. And there's going to be less forward lean of the bar, which is going to put less shear stress on the low back. So generally, narrow stance is going to be healthier for the hips and the low back, a little bit harder on the knees. You can probably look at the pros and cons of narrow stance and make a good assumption of what it's going to be for the wide stance. Wide stance is going to use more hips, glutes, and hamstrings as the primary mover, which is good if the main goal is to just move as much weight as possible. Wide stance is going to be harder to achieve depth because you're going to get into that deep hip flexion earlier, and it's going to make it harder for your hips to sink below parallel. It's also going to be harder on your hips and low back. Because you're getting into the deeper flexion in the hips, it's going to put more stress on the hip joint. It's also going to be more challenging on the low back because you're going to have a forward lean, and it's going to increase that moment arm or that lever from your low back to where the heavy bar is located. So more stressful on the hips and the low back, but you guessed it, it's easier on the knees. You can keep your knees more vertically stacked over your feet, less forward shin movement, and because of that, less knee flexion, and it's probably going to feel better on your knees. That wraps up the advanced video on stance width for the squat.